Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this Bruges Group meeting. In these troubled times for our parliamentary democracy, I'm very pleased to introduce two outstanding public servants. One is a former Foreign Office official, and the other is a Member of Parliament. Sir Andrew Green was a professional diplomat for 35 years, and during that time he served as our ambassador in Syria and Saudi Arabia. He is chairman of Immigration Watch UK. Sir Andrew believes that, contrary to what we are told by the major parties in this country, the United Kingdom has lost control of its borders. Immigration Watch UK is an independent think tank which aims to provide the public with full and accurate facts about immigration. The debating of immigration must not become the sole preserve of extremists. Sir Andrew became aware of the problems of immigration during the 1990s when he was the Foreign Secretary's principal advisor on the Middle East. The Prime Minister of the day asked Sir Andrew to act to remove British Islamic extremists who were claiming asylum in this country. But regrettably, Sir Andrew then became aware of the frustrations caused by the actions of the British courts. Tonight, Sir Andrew has produced a paper on asylum and immigration policy as it exists under the EU, and we must raise the question as to whether membership of the EU is compatible with proper immigration control in the United Kingdom. Sir Andrew.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for your invitation. It's a pleasure to speak to such a highly informed audience, and I shall be ready for your questions later in the evening. Can you hear me at the back? You can? It's always safer to ask that question at the beginning. One of my colleagues once asked it halfway through, and somebody at the back stood up and said, "Can't hear a thing," which was slightly unfortunate. It got worse because somebody at the front stood up and said, "I can hear every word." He said, "Let's change places." So if you're all happy where you're sitting, I will proceed. My subject tonight is immigration and the impact of the EU. Now, both these topics, both immigration and the EU, are matters of very considerable concern to the electorate. And yet, strangely, they are very seldom discussed on their merits. Indeed, immigration is seldom discussed at all, for fear, I think, of being branded as either a xenophobe or a racist or both. Well, as the chairman said, having spent my career in the Foreign Service, I'm not in the least bit concerned about either of those charges. I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes and then take questions to cover the points of most interest to you. I suggest that if we are to carry conviction on European matters and immigration matters, then we must be clear where they overlap and reinforce and where they don't. So I will try to disentangle those two subjects a little. I'm going to start by sketching out the scale and nature of the immigration problem that our country now faces. Then I'll go on to outline the European aspects, and I'll conclude by suggesting a constructive way forward. First of all, the problem. We are not opposed to immigration and still less to immigrants, but we do think the numbers got out of hand. We do think that the government have lost control of the borders. I would have thought that that was obvious. Immigration on a modest scale is a natural part of an open economy, and we favour that. We don't favour what is going on now, but it is a surprisingly new problem. It worked. As you can see from this, this is the net immigration into England. And actually, there was no immigration until the early 80s. It was emigration, a net outflow of people. It wasn't until 1997 that the numbers started to rise very sharply indeed. And they rose as a result of action and inaction by the government. So talk of a nation of immigrants is frankly claptrap. Foreign immigration is now running at about 250,000 a year, or 900 a day. That's net. So in total there have been roughly 3 million net immigration into Britain in the last 10 years. That's the ones we know about. There are also, of course, illegal immigrants of the order of maybe 750,000. So perhaps it's not surprising that public concern has mounted over that time. Quite intriguing, a lot of concern in 79-80, when I think Mrs. Thatcher raised it as an election issue. Then during the years of Conservative government, as it happens, virtually no interest. People felt that it was a matter that was being dealt with satisfactorily. And surprise, surprise, from 1997, it started to shoot up. And of course, that point is the financial crisis of last autumn. And now immigration is second equal with crime. I think something like economy is top with 65%, immigration and crime about 30%. And then you get down to trivial matters like health and education, which are 15%. So, what's the impact of all this? Well, the impact on the population is frankly enormous. This shows you the impact on England. Almost all immigration is to England, by the way, about 95% of foreign immigration. And on the government's own figures, our population will increase by 10 million in the next 20 years, and 70% of that will be a result of immigration. These are their numbers, not mine. And here you can see the red is the principal projection. That is what the Office for National Statistics think is the most likely future. And you can see what that is doing. There are other scenarios, a higher assumptions give you that, of course. If there was no migration at all, you get the pale blue. And this is England, so we're looking at a population now of 51, the UK being 61. So if there's no immigration at all, you get the pale blue. If you had balanced migration, that's one in, one out, you get this darker grey. And the red is what the government expect. Now, clearly, when you go out to 2051, it gets less likely, less accurate. But the history of the last 50 years is that the ONS get it right on a 20-year forecast. The ONS get it right to within a few percent. So if you look at 2031, 2028, that probably is what will happen. 60 million in England, 70 million in the UK. Now, that, of course, has one rather obvious effect on something called housing. Oops.
Excuse me, is it possible to raise the screen?
Is it possible to raise the screen? You can't see the x-axis, the y-axis, the x-axis. See if we can. Okay. Right. So that's what happens to population. Now, another way of looking at it, at the impact, is to look at the number of births to mothers born outside the UK. And as you can see, the proportion since 1971, or indeed since 1997, has doubled. Now nearly 1 child in 4 is born to a foreign-born mother. And so both the proportion and the numbers have doubled. It also means we've got to build one or two houses. 40% of all new households in the next 20-odd years are as a result of immigration. 39 to be precise. Now, the government, frankly, tried to conceal that, and you will find it if you look at their statistical release, page about 50, annex about 30, bottom line, and do the arithmetic. That's the answer. 2 out of 5 new houses or new homes are required for new immigrants. And what's the benefit of this? The House of Lords conducted the only major survey ever conducted in Britain of the economic value of immigration. And they concluded that there was no significant benefit to the resident population. Surprise, surprise, they've done similar surveys in Australia, Holland, United States, Canada, all major reviews, and they came to exactly the same conclusion. How the government got away with it all these years, I do not know. But they got blown out of the water by the House of Lords, and they thoroughly deserved it. So, why do these people come? Clearly, there is benefit to immigrants, that's why they come. But these are the categories in which they come. And I said at the beginning that they come as a result of government action and inaction. So you can see here that these are spouses which have doubled since the regulations were loosened in 1997. This is asylum, which got out of control and is now, we hope, coming back under control. And the red line is work permits, which the government have trebled as a matter of policy. So that's an outline of the problem, if you like. Let me turn now to the European aspects, which will be perhaps of particular interest to you. I think it's fairly clear that free access to about 500 million people is not the best recipe for border control, but I would put it to you that it's not entirely hopeless. This graph, now I hope you can see that, this separates out EU migration and non-EU migration. If you can see, as I hope you can, the bottom of the screen, this golden line is British emigration, which you can see has doubled to about 100,000 in the last 10 years, doubled from 50 to 100,000. If you look at the top line, this is what has happened to migration from outside the European Union, and again, that has roughly trebled. And this is the key, though, that it looks a sort of magenta, bluey kind of line, this one here. What this shows you is migration from the EU 15, effectively. And here is the blip that came after the addition of Spain, Portugal, and Greece. And it came down practically to zero. And here is the huge blip when Eastern Europeans were admitted in 2004. So I would argue that over time, East European migration will fall back, and that the real problem lies in the Third World. One of the key questions is how soon East European migration will fall back. There's some anecdotal evidence that people going home, and some statistics today suggested that the numbers going home are increasing. Others are staying on, some are bringing their families over, and some apparently who went home to Poland, couldn't get a job, are coming back here. So the pattern is very unclear, but there are a number of reasons why, in the end, it will come into balance. The first is that their economies will catch up with ours. Secondly, their populations are falling fast. Thirdly, in 2 years' time, the rest of the European Union will have to open their borders. And lastly, the exchange rate has gone through the floor for East European workers. There's one other point which is arithmetical. It's so obvious that you won't have thought of it. It is that with 1 million odd people already here, as they start to drift back, that's an awful lot of people going back. They're not all here forever. So given the huge lump that has arrived, then arithmetically a fair number will start to come back. And then the two will meet and it will come into balance. Of course, Romania and Bulgaria will take longer, both countries in a shambles. And a recent Romanian government survey found that 600,000 people in Romania were quite determined to emigrate. And the top preference for their destination was, I think you've guessed it, yeah, UK 21%, Spain 16%, Italy 11%. So we are the El Dorado. But the good news is that in the long term, those countries have declining populations, whereas the third world hasn't. Which brings me to Turkey. Now, Turkey does not have a declining population, far from it. It is the wild card in our demographic future. To open our borders to 80 and perhaps by then 100 million Turks strikes me as extremely foolish. You've all heard the strategic arguments for including Turkey in the European Union. Well, I'm not here to talk about strategy and politics, but my own view of those arguments is that they are rubbish. And there's certainly nothing set against the likely impact on our own society of such a massive addition to the likely flow of migrants into this country and others. And we should not allow ourselves to be fobbed off with transitional periods and all that kind of stuff. They all come to an end. In 2 years' time, everybody, 70 million people from the A8, will be fully entitled to the welfare state. And that transitional period went by in a flash. But as usual, the government and the opposition are stone deaf when it comes to the I word. I think they need to wake up to the consequences of their timidity. Now, as regards immigration from the rest of the world, as you know, we're not part of Schengen. Their visas are not valid for us, and the government have not opted into any of the directives on immigration. And therefore, from that point of view, we are to some extent separate from Europe and fairly effectively. Now, I'm going to shorten my remarks at this point because there's a paper on asylum matters that is, for those who are, it's a very good survey, by the way, of EU asylum policy, but it's 30 pages long, and there are some annexes that are 20 pages long. So it's there as a service to the public. Anyone who wants to know about that, they can go to our website or they can pick up that copy. I'm going to jump straight to an opinionated conclusion about their asylum policy. Is it a pointless bureaucracy? Well, largely. There is some limited benefit because the Dublin arrangements allow us to send back people who have claimed elsewhere in Europe. But of course, guess what? The people traffickers have thought of that. So they tell their guys, don't you go claiming in France or Greece or anywhere, you get over to England, make your claim there, and they can't send you back. And so we can't. Does one size fit all? Of course not. But for so long as we stay out of Schengen, as I hope we most certainly hope we will, then we will never fit the pattern. Is it mission creep by the Commission? Well, obviously. Is it meat and drink for the asylum lobby? You bet. Is it a disaster for Britain? Well, no. As usual, the footwork has been quite good. Most of these directives, and 50 pages of them at least, well, more than that, have been moulded so that they conform pretty well to what the UK did anyway. The problem now is, of course, that the Commission wants to go further. quite apart from wanting to have greater unity with everything, they want to have not just minimum standards, they want common standards, and that is running into trouble. The government actually plucked up the courage to opt out of the last asylum directive, so there is hope. Perhaps they realise that public patience is wearing very thin. Let me move on to what can be done. Now, I would argue that EU membership poses some problems for immigration control, but they're not the only problems, and they're not the main ones. The main problem is the political feebleness that surrounds this subject. None of the three major parties will seriously address the issues, despite the widespread public concern. They are all bluffing. And if you look at their manifestos for the EU elections, you will see that they are, I have to watch my words here, extremely feeble. In the short term, of course, this is a big help to the BNP, which is the only fairly major party to have the courage even to address the subject. I said BNP, I meant UKIP. But in the longer term, I confuse them, I shouldn't, I know. But there is a difference here. UKIP have got the courage to address the issue, and they will benefit from it. But in the longer term, there is a serious risk of leaving the field wide open to the BNP, and that is extremely unfortunate. Because you see, Labour are bluffing when they talk about a tough Australian-based system. It's not tough, it's not Australian style, because the Australians start from a limit and select within it. So it's simply untrue. The Conservatives are bluffing with their talk about a cap on work permits, because work permits are only one small part of the problem. And the Liberal Democrats are bluffing with their attacks on illegal immigration and their total silence on all the key issues. What is needed, finally, is a clear policy objective, which is exactly what the House of Lords suggested. At the moment, I don't know whether you'll believe this or not, but at the moment, the number of people who come to this country is a kind of accidental result of hundreds of pages of immigration rules, not to speak of court judgments on asylum matters. It's an accidental result. There is no policy. The government have no policy on how many people they want to have in this country, and no policy on what population they want in this country. So if it goes from 60 to 70 to 80 million, well, that's unfortunate. It's amazing. So the first step is to have a policy. The second step is to split work permits from settlement. Then you cap the settlement, you tighten various other rules, and actually you get to what we want to see, which is balanced migration. That is to bring the number of immigrants down pretty well to the level of the number of emigrants. And these are the benefits that you would gain. Now, you'll find all that set out in a green booklet which is available out there for free. It's a balanced migration booklet, and if you look on the website, it's Migration Watch, by the way, not Immigration Watch. So if you put in Migration Watch to Google, you'll find it, and it is all there. So I rather hope, in conclusion, that the forthcoming EU elections will be an opportunity for the public to speak up loud and clear, so that the leaders of the major parties take note and take action. I think they need to do so soon, if we're to be able to cope with the chaotic situation that they have allowed to develop. A situation which I think places at risk the future well-being of our society.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Andrew. Our second speaker is Richard Shepherd. Richard Shepherd is a distinguished parliamentarian. He's twice won the Spectator Parliamentarian of the Year award. He's the parliamentary vice chairman of the Freedom of Information campaign. And I see that one of our national newspapers listed him as one of the 20 most frugal MPs regarding the claiming of expenses. As I say, Richard is a parliamentarian of impeccable credentials. It was my privilege to serve with him for 5 years in the House of Commons. I always considered that one of the benefits of being a Member of Parliament is that one could become a colleague of those parliamentarians that one had previously admired as an observer. Certainly in my case, to become a colleague of men such as John Biffin and Richard Shepherd was a privilege. Richard would have made an outstanding Speaker of the House of Commons. But regrettably, for too long, the House of Commons has devalued independence of thought and judgment. Today, it is paying a heavy price for its own misjudgments. Those of us in the Bruges Group know that today's difficulties are due not just to the greed and venality of individual members of Parliament, but it is primarily due to the fact that power has drained away from that institution. Quite frankly, MPs have been left with too little to do. Whereas previously they debated throughout the night and voted upon the great issues of today, now the 3-day week and the 16-week holiday have become the norm. The role of a glorified social worker is no substitute. Their efforts at self-aggrandizement through the lavish use of taxpayers' money is deplorable. But if it was just a question of devising a new and acceptable system of claiming expenses, the problem would be easily soluble. Regrettably, what lies at the heart of this crisis is the fact that both houses of Parliament have given away our right to self-government. And at that, without even consulting us. Regrettably, that is not a problem that the House of Commons is even remotely prepared to face up to at this stage. Ladies and gentlemen, I would now like you to welcome one of our finest parliamentarians, Richard Shepherd MP.
None of that was true. He's a generous and good friend, and there are a great many reasons for admiring the chairman of this meeting, and that would probably make a better speech by me than what I'm going to say. They both, of course, shot my bolt in the sense that we had the most eloquent exposition in the old-fashioned manner of actually looking at facts. That is a long, long way from the Commons now. I wanted to just put a puzzle, but in a sense it's been answered. The puzzle was, during the last election, a man from an adjoining constituency came and helped me in our beleaguered campaign, and I asked, what did he do? Oh, I'm Her Majesty's Inspector of Schools. And he really wanted to put to me the proposition that he had been inspecting a school in Ealing. I toured schools for my learning, and I rested in Ealing for a couple of terms or a couple of years, And it was a suburban or outer London fine borough. It was recognizable with gardens and houses, and everyone I looked at, I was puzzled. Why did he say this about Ealing? And he said, in the school that he had been to, there were 27 people in a class, children, in a class, met all the government's figures, and there were 24 languages. And he said he was very worried that there would be an explosion, because I just ask you, any one of you here, if your child went to a school in a local authority where there were 27 children and 24 of them spoke a different language, do you not feel that your child is not getting the opportunity to learn that we reasonably expect every child to have? The teachers were under enormous pressure, he said. They drafted in at great expense linguists, but it's beyond the resources of our system. Why, when you hear our very distinguished speakers' analysis, hasn't there been a revolt? Why isn't this central? It's one of two great issues that the public identify at the heart of debate in the Commons. That's the puzzle. Why? What's happened to our political processes? And there were two great seminal acts that happened in the last 60 years that profoundly altered our Constitution. The first was the Council of Europe. Everyone thinks of the Court of Human Rights as somehow been there always, non-contentious or anything. Who joined us into this organization? It was a Labour government. But what is carefully forgotten and lost is this was an enormously difficult, in those days, decision for a Labour government. Lord Jowett was the Lord Chancellor. And what he was frightened of, not frightened because we weren't frightened, we'd won a war. Europe was the anxiety, the march of communism from the east, the strengthening of the near democracies. Of course, Czechoslovakia fell, Hungary had fallen, etc. They wanted strengthening of human rights, as we now call it. The British government understood civil liberties. The debate was, there's nothing wrong with civil liberties, they're fundamental to our view of what Britain is, from Magna Carta, Bill of Rights, right through, civil liberties. And they consoled themselves with the thought, well, this is really just a putting together of our traditional liberties. No, says the jurist. This is putting a court above all our law and our legal system. Yes, you know the weariness of the great and the good. Yes, but they can never bring us in front of this court. We are the sort of father of these great ambitions for Europe. And indeed, on that basis, the decision was taken by a Labour government with a majority of 6 just prior to the 1952 election. And indeed it came to pass just as those well said for just 12 years. And Britain lost its first case in front of the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice, you probably all know, is, with the exception of Ireland and England, a civic jurisdiction, civic law jurisdiction, whereas we are a common law tradition. Allegiance to the law, which was crafted over a very long time, was deep in the soul of Britons. So that was the first thing. You had set the greatest constitutional revolution for, I guess, 1,000 years one can claim, but 400 years, 500 years, whatever you want. That was an enormous revolution. And one of the inhibitions that our distinguished visitor notes in passing is that the determination of who may come here and on what grounds they may claim asylum is now no longer made ultimately in our legal courts, but ultimately by the European Court in Strasbourg. And there's something very important about the European Court in Strasbourg. Although you could read the first draft, and in fact the first act of what their competences were, you would have difficulty in not thinking, but this rests on the English tradition, and it is true. There are words and phrases within it that are lifted from the Bill of Rights. You will find some of those words and phrases identically in the American Constitution, the first 10 amendments. This is the continuum, and there they are in the European Convention on Human Rights. But no court is static. They're interpretive. And as an international court, it takes upon itself the right to seek legal parallels. And at the heart of those are United Nations conventions. And through their annexing in their judgments, European judgments, the United Nations conventions, which have never been legislated for by our domestic law, we take on a whole body of the goodwill of ambassadors who have encouraged governments to sign up some of these, the United Nations Convention on the Child. This is the one great struggle that the British government currently has, and what is it about? Reasonable chastisement. The United Nations Convention banishes what the opponents of reasonable chastisement say is brutalizing or intimidating children. They are moving to try and get us to cease this. We are in contravention, they claim, of an obligation in international law. So that's one blow to the system of our Constitution. And then not long after that, we joined, hooray, hooray, the European Communities. And the European Communities Act, which was fiercely fought. I would have loved to have been there when it was going through and joining those. But I was one, just like many of you in this room might have been, who believed in free trade. We need to energize competition. We wanted to have the cold shower of reasonableness that comes through the interchange of economies, etc. And Britain was in decline. And would not competitiveness reawaken the vigor that extended us as to one of the great commercial powers in the world? Unfortunately, it wasn't quite like that, because what's contained in that? Within days, weeks, months, they claimed they had a legal competence. The European Court, not mentioned in the treaties, the European Court took upon itself, no court in Britain has done this, we do it by the development of common law, took upon itself the right to adjudicate down to important issues of national and domestic policy. We had sowed another pass. And although I can see you're all of a generation, not all of you, sorry, I know we're all early middle age, of course, but you'll see what's happened. Our courts now are dependent courts. So that's that. Now what's happened in politics? We've had a peasants' revolt in the Commons. It is outrageous, isn't it, to think a supine body, I can't say this of the Lords, has now given over to the great struggle that is characterized our development as a democracy, all power to the Crown in Downing Street. I've seen romantic conservatives in the Commons who said, but the Queen shouldn't sign this. It's contrary to her coronation oath. And Although that may be so, there is a coronation oath. The fact remains, the crown isn't at that end of the mall. The crown is across Whitehall there in Downing Street. We won the struggle to cage the king. We lost the struggle to cage the crown. And so when the minister stands in front of them, they have all the imperium of being the crown. Treaties are negotiated by the crown, the prerogative power. There is no necessity for them to ever come before Parliament unless they have within them something like the European Communities Act or the formation of the Strasbourg Court. They would not have authority here. That is what we surrendered. And in doing that, looking back at 66, looking back, we hollowed out the absolute essence of what was England, and for that matter, Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland. We subordinated the people of England to new masters. I put it in rousing language, but that is the substance of that argument. Who did it? Why they did it? They weren't there, the macavities of our history. But they burgled it. And what they left behind was a dominant executive with a Commons that looked for patronage rather than the duty for which they were elected, which was to hold the executive to account. Using those very words has an echo of fustiness now, doesn't it? It's meaningless to most of the people of England. It's meaningless to the people of England that caused a revolution, that sought the overthrow of kings, that asserted, I'm not saying this was an easy course, and I'm not trying to pretend that this was democracy, but ours was a long march of every man to secure that democracy. And for a brief period, I believe, it flourished in this country. The Commons could change governments. A bad minister and a bad speech meant he went. Tell you something telling. I don't remember what the bill was, but Mrs. Thatcher, who is the patroness, of course, of this great society, sat in a debate. Gosh, Prime Minister sitting through a debate. What an indignity. Sat through a debate and became glummer and glummer as she heard the argument of the opposition. She turned to the Chief Whip and said, "We cannot proceed with this." She had not won the argument. We, the government, had not won the argument. Can you imagine any modern government that we've had, certainly in the last 11 years, being troubled about winning an argument? That's the difference. Times change, great landslides blot out the collective memory of great institutions. I would argue that Parliament has lost its sense of itself. It cannot distinguish between the princes that parade on my side and the princes that parade on the other side, that can barely waste a minute in the Commons. It was a joy once to see when the new police bill was going through for Northern Ireland that I know he's a popular minister, but Mandelson was at that time Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and he had pumped himself up to deliver the third reading speech of the triumphs of New Labour, naturally. Unfortunately, the great device that they've used to suppress the Commons is the guillotine. The government has the right to initiate everything that goes to the floor of the House of Commons. There are only two great exceptions. Private members' bills consigned to a Friday that can be lost in the committee room upstairs. And opposition days. And they expanded those to 18 trivial days, whilst new princes parade with policies they don't believe in for 3 hours at a time and speak for 2.5 of them, so backbenchers can't even get in. That's the new politics. It is only two armies clashing, and I'm not even a spear holder. but I can throw a spear sometimes, and do. And so do good people when they can get the eye of the speaker. That's where we've got to. And at the heart of our frustrations and our disappointments and the inability to argue this in the Commons, the first time I heard of Sir Andrew Green, the first time I heard the argument set forth in the early stages of this was when Nicholas Soames had an adjournment debate. An adjournment debate. This is something that was cast at the end of a long day. Members had long ago disappeared. So he speaks to an empty chamber and he puts out the arguments. Does a government minister answer these questions? No. Why would he bother? And anyway, isn't it better we've discovered spin? You're racists. That's what you are. I sit in my surgery and people say ordinary things that were part of the conversation of things. Oh, I shouldn't have said that, they say. They do it half mockingly. It's not politically correct, they say. In those little expressions, you see the vitality drain away from what was an argumentative, difficult England to govern, Scotland to govern, with all its passions and where we came from. And that's what we're reduced to. Now, the peasants' revolt that happened was because Labour, in its arrogance, they don't have to attend. They weren't even conscious that there was a Speaker of the House of Commons. He did what he was expected to do. That was part of our history at one time. The King wanted to have the Speaker as his man. It doesn't work always. And now you see the disintegration of Parliament. The contempt it has heard. Of course, when I joined, when our chairman joined, there was a little purse, and it was called expenses. And the answer at the fees office, whatever the question was no. It was very depressing sometimes because people were genuinely hard up. And I may have low expenses, but they looked to me and my mother, who was from Glasgow, enormously high. Enormously high. I was born in Aberdeen, and as you well know, Aberdonians have sporrans made of granite. And no chisels allowed nearby. So that is where we've got. Feed them. If you've got a little purse and they're worried about it, give them a suitcase. And we've got whips who will ensure that the fees office understands the meaning of the necessity of these great people. I am a Richard Shepherd MP. When I was a boy, Member of Parliament meant something. Now it is almost a matter of scorn and derision. So how, without the power to initiate it in the Commons, a power that went under the Joplin Committee reforms, never debated, never in fact discussed during the debates on the Joplin Committee reforms, which looked for something called timetabling. Does the Commons timetable its business? Oh yes, because it's voted on. Who crafts the motion? The government. And so you have a passion. You have spent your life arguing for something. It is on the order paper. Who selects the amendments for discussion? The Speaker of the House of Commons. So if it is the most contentious issue, and he puts it as the last item of a 3-hour guillotine to discuss a 600-page bill with 47 propositions that would get your blood boiling, you never reach it. And that's how we are managed. It is shaming. So this immigration need never feature. And we have all those, we've seen the grotesqueness of it revealed. Spin is the master that keeps the Crown in Downing Street, that keeps the Commission in Brussels, and keeps the court in Strasbourg. They're doing it for our own good, and we are impotent. We have to revolt. That was the history of the
Thank you very much indeed, Richard, and thank you for all the experience, intelligence and thought that went into that speech tonight. We are truly grateful. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it's your opportunity to ask questions of our two distinguished speakers. Yes, I'll take a question from the gentleman.
Yes, this society, one of the major...
Yes, one of the major preoccupations of this society is the export of sovereignty, the export of government. And would you agree, gentlemen, that the recent much publicised scandals relating to Parliament serve the long-term process of the disempowerment and the marginalisation of Parliament only too well?
There's a story told, isn't there? The more a man spoke of his honour, the faster we counted the spoons. That's how I feel we are. And we've always been a bit like that. The grand and the great in this country like their plumes and their helmets and their right honourables and their badges of distinction over the people. And that's why I feel deeply ashamed by that. It is true, wherever you go in the world, they get it wrong. This is the mother of parliaments. We know the expression. England was the mother of parliaments. We don't appropriate that to ourselves. That was the people that did it. And there was an enormous pride. We got to self-government through this long march before almost anywhere else. The United States threw us out and asserted our principles. The struggle for the 1832 Reform Bill. That was working, well, rather groundworking men from the areas around Birmingham. No constituency of itself for Birmingham in 1832. But the extension of the franchise was trivial. 1865, an enormous enfranchisement increase. And so we could gradually say that governments in England were accountable to informed public opinion and the right of them to vote. And it engaged people. What is there to vote about now? Where is the engagement? Where is the public meeting? Where is the right that argued for a cause? But that concept of the shame I feel when I look at these faux parliaments almost elsewhere, and I'm sorry I'm going on so long, but the greatest shock, there were two things that happened to me. I'm a governor of the London School of Economics. Of course, it's got funds from the European Union, and of course it puts on show cases to do it. During Maastricht, they assembled Schmidt, Giscard d'Estaing, and Ted Heath. The first three rows, other than the governors, were the German embassy, naturally, with the Mercedes outside in Howland Street, and the ambassadors from the community, and the students sat up at the back. I'm ashamed to think, though, that Schmidt and Giscard were of a higher order of intellect and of argument than Ted Heath. Maybe he was just having a grumpy day. At the end of it, one student said, but I don't understand this thing. I'd like to think it was me as a young man, but this is what he said. How is it, he said, public opinion polls say that 80% of Germans are against Maastricht. Schmidt, elderly at that time, piped, slightly deaf, etc., tapping it into his thing, said, I'll tell you one thing. Public opinion says one thing on a Friday and something totally different on a Monday. But in Germany, this is a matter for the political class, and it will pass through the Bundestag with an 80% majority. Now, I'd introduced Nick, there was a gasp incidentally from the students upstairs. This was not their view of what democratic politics was about. I'm glad to report, I don't know what it is 17 years later, but that was the then view, and the complacency of that. It was the introduction to me of the concept of the political class. Gosh, don't we learn fast. So do they now. They don't care in that sense. We got a vote, and that's the end of the matter. The second thing was, I'm going to forget that, but it's related to it, so, and I've taken up far too much time on spoons.
Well, I'm not a politician, of course, but I'm not entirely sure that the events of the last week or two are going to strengthen the case for expatriating our powers to Brussels. I think many people will...
I think the Commons will get weaker.
The Commons will get weaker, but...
So the Gentleman's Club is going to be, that's the end of it, and the power's going to be cut even further.
No, I think this is an opportunity. This is our moment, and this is our chance. We've got to get the right speaker. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
And they are, for the first time in my time in Parliament, in a very strong position. This government is reading. You can see it now. It's drained the vitality and everything. It's over. It's busted. I'm not sure that we're quite ready yet, and we've got an election there. So this is a sort of lingering death, I feel. We've seen them before, haven't we? But this is a lingering death.
But it's not necessarily going to help the cause of Brussels. I think people are just as suspicious of MEPs and all that goes on in Brussels. I think they're all in the same boat.
Okay. Gentleman in the glasses, pink shirt. Can you just wait till we get the microphone to you, sir?
What a wonderful speech Richard Shepard made. One tries to work out what is behind all these wrong things that are going on. And when you think, and it'd be interesting if you do have an observation, Blair went to war in Iraq, and against all the public opinion of on legal, he leaves the premiership, joins JP Morgan, and gets £500,000 a year. Is there some connection there?
Richard, would you like to go into Mr. Blair's motives?
Just two rooms. Turkey. Our foreign policy has been, for good strategic reasons, so linked and directed by our relationship with the United States. I'm terribly pro-American. But I went over there, and first of all, awful bits. I went to the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced Science, was called then, in Washington. Second man at the Defense Pentagon was Wolfowitz. He had been the director of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. It was unbelievable. Rationality of a professor out the window. He was trying to show me newspaper cuttings from Middle Eastern countries saying America's the devil, hang Americans, and things like that. Foreign policy was based on vulgar opinion expressed through newspapers there. That was evidence of the fact that they were against. The second thing, moved from there to the State Department. And there it's taken for granted that Turkey must enter the European Union. They have their own strategic goals and needs. They have assets in Turkey. It's part of their international global Watch the World program. They want to consolidate Turkey in the European Union. I said, and there was a huge pause, they were shaken. Who's this man? I said, what business is it of yours that Turkey should join the European Union? No British minister had suggested to them that we would do otherwise than what they wanted. And I think that that's part of the history of the Iraq War, for instance. So we've lost. And this, of course, all treaties and matters like that are the royal prerogative, exercised across horse guards. And these are often secret. Of course they're secret because they may be matters that are vital to our own survival. But it's the whole drift of where we are now. Subordinate, protesting that we're bigger than we are, and yet the qualities that distinguish us in this world were our sense of life and liberty. And that's what we've lost. I spoke to a very recent former head of the security services, and she said, Richard, the person said, Richard, I think the first duty of government is life. And we were talking about, and then went on to talk about something else. The American judges are interested in having habeas corpus and some matters like that. And I thought about that. I'd like you to think about it too. Now everything is, life is so precious, they say. I wonder, if we were at the bottom of a dungeon for 40 years, is life so precious? Why did soldiers go forth in 1939 that knew nothing about Czechoslovakia or Germany or anything? Why were they prepared to give their lives as Birmingham and Coventry were being bombed and London losing 3,000 people in the course of one night towards the end of the war? They believed in something else more than just life. It was liberty. And I think they're co-joined. And I think this nation's lost the spirit that the two are indistinguishable. There is no England without life and liberty. To be subordinate to other people who determine the most sensitive thing of all, what constitutes liberty, is a very shaming position for we or our forebears who made this long march to a democratic society that had a sense of itself.
Sir Andrew, have you got any comment on this particular aspect?
Don't start me on Iraq. I'm totally opposed to it from the start. It's a disaster, and they completely failed to take the professional advice they were given. So,
thank you. Gentleman in the glasses on the third row there. Microphone just coming.
Can I just preface my question by saying that at the start of next month, it's 36 years since Ted Heath made two speeches, one in which he said there will be no loss of essential national sovereignty in the context of the European or the economic community. What a lie that was. And 10 years later, he said there will be no further large-scale immigration into this country. And everything that's happened in this country, the issue of identity associated with Europe and immigration, in my view, can stem from that. My question is to Sir Andrew, because you said in your excellent speech, you said, I don't know how the government have got away with it. Well, isn't the answer to that they have deliberately contrived to defeat the will of the British people year after year by pressing? I don't say a multiracial society because people have always lived in a world with other people of different races, but certainly within the context of a multicultural society which no one really wants. And political correctness, there's never been a test of national opinion, there's never been a referendum, there has never been a plebiscite or any other way of engaging the involvement of the British people, and the British people don't like it. So quite frankly, my opinion is, don't let's be too surprised at the results of the European elections on June 4th.
Indeed. Well, I think your question goes to whether all this is a conspiracy or a cock-up. It's obviously a cock-up. The capability of the Home Office to control immigration has always been amazingly weak, and actually the desire has been pretty weak. The Home Office have what they call a tradition, a liberal tradition, which in effect means you duck out of any difficult decision, certainly on immigration. Whether it was a conspiracy or not, I think to some extent those on the far left of the spectrum did want to change the nature of our country, to get rid of the dominance of those horrible middle-class people. And that if they could change the whole texture of society, then of course that's a wonderful thing. I'm not saying that that was the main motivation, but it was certainly a motivation of some of them, and these things came together. They've got away with it because people won't talk about it, people won't address it, people won't raise it. And I think a major reason for that is, I fear, the BBC. Because I think that the BBC, quite understandably, have long been opposed to racism, but they've allowed that to morph into support for multiculturalism without any conditions, and to morph further into support for immigration without any limits. And I think that is very unfortunate. It runs right through the organisation, and the people who actually organise the programmes, the producers, all tend to be quite young people, and they don't think that their career is going to be advanced by suggesting that there should be an item on immigration. And banal though it is, I think that is an overwhelming factor, certainly in Radio 4. And the way in which the BBC refuses to address it, I think, runs right through society. People feel, well, they shouldn't actually be talking about this, there's something not right about it, something racist about it, and therefore it is spread right through the society. And that has taken the spirit away from many people who privately, as Richard was saying, have very strong views on this. We did a poll only yesterday, and 80% of the public are concerned about this. Half of those very concerned. And 70% want a massive reduction in immigration. Will the government respond to that? Will they help? Will the Conservatives? We shall see.
Gentleman on the front row.
Thank you very much. Just two observations and one question. The last time the British, I think, didn't follow the Americans when Wilson wouldn't allow any troops to go into Vietnam, and I think that was a long time ago when we drifted back. The BBC is so good with Iraq, Iran, and it's such a nice place to be. Have you looked at the Iran service at all? It's sort of, they can't say much, I suppose, really, because they've been kicked out. But I just think the BBC is just spending too much time. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, just let's get to the question. That'll be good.
And the other point was you talked about the sort of the political class in Germany. And if you go back to 46, 47. They had, after the denazification process, they had democracy classes. This is all from the yesterday programme we picked it up. And that seems to have fallen down. Now, the question is, do you think it's the way France and Germany have their colleges for the diplomatic service and they control everything that goes in?
I think they've always looked at an electoral system. Ben said of democracy, he actually has 5 points, but I'll condense it. There's only 2 questions to ask. Who makes the laws? If you don't know them, it's a bit worrying. And how do you get rid of them? Well, if you don't know them and you don't know how to get rid of them, you're in real trouble. And that's what we conceived as a system of government. The electoral process in Europe, because it came when Schmidt was saying about the political class will pass. Kohl was Prime Minister or Chancellor of Germany. He lost his seat, if you remember, in the election. He was the representative for Bonn. But he remained in the Bundestag because he was head of the list system. So how do you get rid of them? And that's what they've created in continental Europe. And you're seeing it now in the list system for these European elections.
Yeah.
I may detest the top man on the Conservative list. Who put them there anyway? I won't vote for him. But if I don't vote for him, I won't get the man that I really do admire, or the woman, who's 3rd or 4th down. And furthermore, you can't have a by-election. You can appoint someone to Parliament should someone decide to resign and go on because they got an offer of a better job. So that's what's also happening to our electoral system. We've diffused it. One clear great thing about our old-fashioned system is I know how to get rid of someone as a voter. I go around and agitate, and I say, we're not having this person. And if people share my view, we can get rid of them. On a list system, I can go around these huge constituencies where there is no linkage and no knowledge even of the names of the MEPs. That's the systems that we're creating. And I think when we talk about continental systems, at the heart of them is this concept that there's a particular class that is wise and specializes in public affairs, and you shouldn't trouble yourself with them. Are we not getting that now? Today, when Cameron said, I mean, I think it's a crazy question, shouldn't we have an election now? What Brown says, there would be chaos. What do you mean chaos? What do you think we've got?
Gentleman on the back row.
Thank you for outlining the problems so very well. What's the way back from a dysfunctional parliament, a system that seems to discourage completely anyone of any sort of independent mind from entering it, on both sides of the House, a Conservative Party that has a leader that supports Turkey joining the EU. What do we do about this? What's the way back? What's the way to get regain control of our own destinies again? And what's the way to encourage more people, such as yourself, demonstrating the tremendous character that you've done here this evening from sitting on those benches?
It's very comfortable on benches, and as I get older, it gets more comfortable sitting on benches. There was an American film that you may have seen it called, I think it was Network, was it? Where the news announcer said, "I'm angry as hell," and stormed around and became a great cult figure. Our people, we, are angry as hell. What removed a speaker? Not the Commons. It's the anger out there that has arisen in this. What changes systems is the anger. And there's no way of expressing it at the moment until you have a general election. And then you feel that the political parties have got it sewn up anyway. That you thought you were voting for a referendum on Europe, whatever it was. All three parties pledged that, quite clearly and unambiguously. So what did they try and tell us? That the treaty that they had promised it on it was called a constitution. Now it's called Lisbon, and it's not the same thing. And therefore, the pledge doesn't work. And what does the Conservatives say? We're thinking about it. It can't rest there, is what William Hague said. Can't rest where? Didn't we have an unequivocal pledge? And I think, oh, certainly. But they've all else signed up to it. Now we've edged forward to, we will have one anyway. What is the status of this? Well, it's sort of consultative. Did you hear that? I'll whisper it softly. That's where we're at. I don't like knocking this because in politics there must be choices, and choices should be made on informed public opinion. This is why Sir Andrew does us the greatest service. Anyone going through this is an informed individual. You may not agree with the conclusion that comes from it. I think most of us do, if not everyone in this room agrees with the conclusion that seems to follow from this information. Something has to be done, certainly. But if you're in ignorance, and if you're detached from the political system, you're just ignorant. And we're now in this fest of celebrity, or whatever it is, on consumerism. All that, the distractions of the modern world, the media, and we have such a reliable ally in the BBC. Its integrity is well known. And wherever I go, the truth is, people out there in the wider world revere the World Service. And I do, because I'm now an insomniac. Inspiration. And I listen to quite a lot of this through the night. 4 o'clock is the beginning of the real listening to it. But I'm listening to it, and I feel somehow it's more detached. But even last night, the news at 10, I was home for 10 o'clock. There was a program on the railroad revival in the United States. You may have heard it on if you listened to it. So you listened to the reporter who talked about distances in kilometers. And he talked about speeds in kilometers per hour. Then they gave us a clip of President Obama, who said that this new investment they're putting into the railroads, they could get the average speed up on some of these long train journeys to 100 miles per hour. Now, this is the British Broadcasting Company putting out one of its premier news slots at 10 o'clock at night, putting together a program by an English reporter. Where did kilometers come into that? America is denominated in miles, as are we. Why? I almost feel like reading your own points of view. Maybe you will all do it. And have an answer. Why? And that's this discontinuation out in Shepherd's Bush and the World Service at what used to be Aldridge.
Sandra, any comment?
Well, there was rather a central question there. What is the way forward? What's the way back? Perhaps is the way to put it. And it is an absolutely central question, and I think we're both struggling to answer it. The first thing I did say, speaking personally, is that a protest vote at the next elections is a start, and the bigger the protest vote, the better. Secondly, if you have views, you should put your money behind them, and you should actually finance those bodies that you think are going to contribute to the thinking, the think tanks you agree with, whatever they may. I'm not talking about myself, but those things that you believe in, you should be prepared to put your money into. And lastly, I have some hopes that over the next 5-10 years, the internet-based discussions and dialogue will start to have much more effect in the UK as they have in the US.
Thank you very much. Can we have a question for the man in the red pullover over there?
On the immigration now, the exposure of the immigration, would you agree that a lot of it is started at the school, where a lot of the children are promised GCEs and all want a top job, and nobody wants to do the actual lower paid jobs? And on the other hand, you've got the welfare system is so good, a lot of the young lads and lasses don't want the lower paid jobs. It's much easier in order to go on the dole. And isn't that an important thing that we ought to address in the schools, not only to our people with IT skills, but also the tradesmen and also the people that's going to do the basic work in there. And once those jobs are fulfilled, then that would have to address that. And don't you think that's one of the reasons why we've left a huge vacancy there in that particular field? You know, you can't even go to a hotel restaurant there, which, you know, the staff is not English there. So don't you think that's the place we ought to start there, in the schools and in the working there?
Absolutely. I think we are generating the most almighty problems for ourselves. We are importing a kind of underclass. And all the jobs that people would be reluctant to do are being done by foreigners, very, very often of a different race. And I don't like to see it. I went to the loo on the way here, and it was a black woman who was cleaning the loo, and I didn't like to see it. Roughly, I think, having been in the army, 30% of any population is not exactly intellectual. And they ought to have jobs that they are proud of doing as work. Whatever it may be, whether it's something perfectly simple but within their capabilities, and they should be proud of it and proud to work, as has always been the case until the last generation or so. Now, we've looked at this with some care. If you are married with 2 children and you're earning the basic wage, the minimum wage, the benefit to you of going out to work is £20 a week. It won't even pay your bus fare. And what's more, as your wages go up from £5.70 to getting on to £8 or £9 an hour, which is quite a lot, you only get about 4% of it. The rest you lose because your various allowances go down. The well-intentioned hope of lifting people out of poverty by credits of various kinds has had the opposite effect. It's meant there's no incentive to work, no benefit to work, and you get people who for generation after generation don't work. And immigration is not an answer to that, it just makes it far worse.
Gentleman with the blue tie. I think you've got quite a strong voice. You can probably make do without the microphone.
Hans-Gert Pottering also came to the LSE shortly after he'd become head of the European Parliament. And he spoke about democracy and how important it was that Britain should remain in the EU. So I called out, sorry, no, we're leaving, we've had enough. And pointed out that only the week before he had called Roger Helmer and Daniel Hannan into his office in the European Parliament and fined them £1,000 each for showing dissent, saying that dissent is not permitted. I pointed out that in this country, we pay Her Majesty's loyal opposition to show dissent. And that is the difference between what he thinks of democracy and what we understand it to be. One quick point for Sir Andrew. I've been a supporter of yours from the very beginning. I'm sorry, therefore, to disagree on just one point. I do not think that balanced migration is a sufficiently good target for three reasons. First of all, we are already seriously overpopulated. Secondly, the nature of the people who are coming in, as you yourself said, is that they will have more children than the nature of the people who are leaving. So that itself will build the population even with zero immigration. And the other one is a point that hasn't really, only just been touched on, and that is that 1 for 1 is not a fair trade when we're importing a crop picker from the fields of Lincolnshire, shall we say, and exporting a nuclear scientist. That is something that terrifies me. As an engineer, when I was a young engineer, most of my friends emigrated because of the brain drain. And it's even worse now amongst people of my age, most of whom say to me, if I wasn't committed by family and friends, I would be off like a shot. And all of them are saying to their children, get out while you can. That, I fear, is what the biggest threat of all is to this country.
Thank you.
I think a large number of people would agree with you. In setting an objective for this cross-party group that we set up last September, we sought something that would be a major and significant step forward. I think you probably, when a situation has deteriorated for 15 years, if not 50, you probably have to address it a slice at a time.
Thank you. I'll take two more questions. The lady on the front row, please.
Good evening, thank you. If UKIP managed to push Labour into third place in the forthcoming EU elections, do you think Cameron would actually take on board the seriousness, more so, of people's feelings with regards to the European Union?
Richard, are you a no as well on that? Right, I'll take another question from the lady in the T-shirt.
It isn't really a question, but I would like to invite you today. I don't really need a microphone, thank you. May I invite you all to the start of a local rebellion on Saturday the 13th of June, 10 o'clock, Friends Meeting House, opposite Euston Underground, conducted by the New Constitution Group, and you're all very welcome.
Thank you for that point of information. Yes, gentleman there in the blue shirt.
I came late into a political mind. Can you hear me yet? I came late into the political field because I was always too busy earning a living and just let the world outside my world get on with it. But for the last 10 years I've been looking seriously at the rise of the European Union through Salter and so on, the Englishman who was partly for it, or made it. However, my view is this. Anybody that talks to me, I will say that our Parliament is like a Halloween pumpkin. It's hollowed out, it's got a rictus grin on its face, and there's a little light inside, it just flickers out, because 80% of anything that we do in this country is controlled by Europe, if I believe everything I've read, and I've read all the political glass, I've read so many books that and yet I've got frustration, I don't know where to direct my energy to make my point known. I'm involved with Libertas now, which is a new thought with gambling, and I believe that that will prove fruition. So my question is, am I a general person that is a cross-section of the population who are reasonably intelligent, we like to get on with our own lives without interfering with others, but when you see corpus juris versus habeas corpus, and the complete about turn where the tail wags the dog, I feel that our political pundits and people that control us are actually fighting downhill. They can't control anything upwards because it's all been given away. So they're fighting for the scraps, and this is why they're so shallow and venal that the populace, the people that I tend to sort of represent, are at the end of the line, and they are just fighting over control of us because they can't control anything upstream. They have to control downstream.
Thank you very much indeed. Richard, have you any comment on that at all?
Well, I feel the frustration, and I think there is another element, the over-centralisation of this country too. So every single decision almost is made in Whitehall. And so the vitality of local government has gone by. The dispersal of funds is all controlled from the centre. So the writ of Whitehall runs much further than it did when I was a boy. What's happened to counties? And now we've got the extraordinary position that in this over-centralised thing, a mute or done for commons, the Lords, an appointed house of NGOs, special interest groups, and the lunatic reforms of Jack Straw, the Lord High Panjandrum. There's nothing he's never had an answer to. None of them work, of course, and he claims it's a consensus. But that's where we're at. We had the institutions that made this society work. You knew when you got a trade or a craft, this was about as good as it got anywhere in the world. And I'm a representative from the West Midlands. When I first went there, those tool makers with those little machines, 1/10,000th of an inch. Of course, that's all the world moves on. It's now computer-aided design and all the rest of it. But the training that goes into it isn't a faux training at all. This has to work, and your skill was recognised. Now nothing is recognised.
It took 5 years as well. Now everybody wants instant gratification. They want to be the top.
Yeah, so that was one form of education. I feel there's been a collapse of education in this country. I couldn't care less what the statistics are. I go around the schools. I teach in one, these care for the demented and the community. And you're accompanied, I was the demented one, it was fine. I know when I grew up, boys were in boys' schools, girls were in girls' schools, by and large, but there were some mixed schools. This was, well, the first time I ever went into a school as a member of Parliament, the headmaster took us down, a bell went off, and he said, lean against the wall. And there was good reason. The screaming stream that came out, and I don't believe scholarship, the respect we had in a small village near Heathrow when I was growing up, for the educated person. The doctor was an educated person. They respected him. The doctor is now threatened with assaults if he doesn't give them a prescription that they want, etc. There was this distinction. The vicar would have been considered an educated person, the doctor, the vicar, etc. like that. This isn't putting out the other classes in any way whatsoever, but there was a sense of all their competences. There was an equality about Britain that we've now lost with this grand gulf in wealth dispersal, which is actually on a scale I don't think we've had since the 18th century and the nabobs from India. This glorification of that. And the civility has gone out of our lives too. That was one of the great restraints on oppressive behaviour and on oppressive government. When I first went in and when a distinguished chairman was in Parliament, the concept that a minister would not argue. I went in 1979, so there were a large number of people who had served in the war. The war is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter whether you've got pips on your shoulders or not. You are in the same firing line. Your back has to be covered by people who
trust. It brings about a respect for your fellow man, and that does away with class barriers. At the end of the day, there are none. And that sense has somehow gone out. I live on a road which was turned into flats. It's called Addison Road. Well, there's no reason why I should. It runs between Holland Park Avenue and Kensington High Street. When I was I do live at number 14 as it happens. When I was a student at LSE, those houses, the big ones, they've got carriage drive. I hasten to add at this point, in case anyone thinks that they had carriage drives in front of them. And my solicitor at the time, Mr. Rubenstein, his grandfather had lived in one of those houses in the days. But war, people left London, as you know, and by 1961, when I went to university, these were Bed City houses. With students in them, I went to visit friends who were also at LSE that were living in Addison Road. Today, I can't say today, 2 years ago, those big houses opposite my gentle little cottage, they were going for 10 to 12 million pounds. You made more money than the people with craft or ability in a lifetime could ever happen upon by the accident or the good fortune to buy a piece of brick in a road in Kensington which had been abandoned. And that's the distortion that fires the imaginations, and this is the correction we're in. The fierceness about part of the parliamentary disgrace is the sense that we are in a major crisis. And if you look at your television this last week, would you ever think we were in a crisis? Other than that, it's so self-centered. We think we're special in Parliament. And we should know it's all our Parliament. And it was the line of our defence for freedom and control. While
that perhaps enlighten somebody like me a bit more as to what UKIP's policy is. I've got to just finish by saying to Richard Shepherd, thank you for all you've done over many years for the British people, and particularly in this last week for standing up and being counted. In this crisis, we the people now have to seize the moment and direct our anger at getting back our democracy, our freedom, our justice and our liberty. And that's the task that all of us will face.
Thank you. Sir Andrew.
Well, I can be very brief. I think what I said was that UKIP have the courage to discuss it and raise it. The details of their policy, I think, are slightly beside the point because they're never going to be the government, but they do have the courage to talk about it. One final point. I think if you had to choose one word as a theme for this evening, it is frustration. I would only say that if that's how you feel, you should put your vote, your money and your time behind whatever cause you believe in.
Right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've had quite an evening. We've had two distinguished speakers, two men of great experience, great wisdom, and considerable eloquence. And we're grateful to both Sir Andrew and Richard for coming here tonight. It was a great pleasure to hear you speak. We've got two more meetings before we break for the summer. The next one in June, we've got Anthony Coughlin, who is going to speak about the Irish situation, the tremendous problems the Euro have created there, and where they stand on their referendum. Edward Lee will be talking about financial irregularities and corruption within the EU at the same meeting. And then on the 8th of July, we're having a drinks party. We are inviting all our speakers over the last year to come along. So it will be a roll call of honour. We will have Simon Heffer, Norman Tebbit, Douglas Carswell, our two speakers this evening, Stuart Wheeler, and also Baroness Thatcher has agreed to attend as well. So ladies and gentlemen, I look forward to seeing you at both of those events.